So Marvel Rivals is out, and I've been playing this game like a madman. I'm obsessed with it. It's amazing. But something that I thought would be cool would be to explain the lore behind a lot of the skins that are in the game. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here is not every skin has lore associated with it. Some of these skins are wholly unique to Marvel Rivals, so there really isn't anything to discuss there. And so kicking things off here, we got to talk about Spider-Man. Now, the first cool skin that they give us here is what they call the No Way Home skin. The reality here, and as most people who are familiar with Marvel Comics know, this is the Civil War skin. But whether it's No Way Home or Avengers Infinity War or Civil War or whatever, most people just refer to it as the Iron Spider suit. Now, most of you guys know that the suit was designed for Spider-Man by Tony Stark during Marvel's Civil War event. What a lot of you guys probably don't know is that the suit has actually kind of made the rounds in Marvel. And in more recent years, it was worn by Miles Morales, albeit a modified version. Now, currently Miles Morales is running around with a vibranium suit made for him by Black Panther. Yes, it's dope. And I'm really excited to see what they do with it. But after the events of Civil War, you actually go into what's called the Initiative, and that ran for a number of comics, but the suit itself was handed over to a group called the Scarlet Spiders, which were kind of modeled after Ben Reilly and Kane. We'll talk about who they are here in a minute, because we're actually going to get into the Chasm skin, which specifically deals with Ben Reilly, as well as what looks like the Kane Scarlet Spider suit. But these three remodeled Iron Spider suits were given to these guys as part of the 50-state initiative. And for those of you guys who were unfamiliar with the aftermath to Civil War, because Tony Stark and Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four and those guys effectively won, the 50-state initiative was implemented, which was essentially a government-sanctioned superhero team in all 50 states. And so much like the original Iron Spider suit, these Scarlet Spider suits pretty much had all the same capabilities. The problem is that all but one of the guys died. They were all basically killed off. And for the most part, it just kind of went defunct after that. It did kind of bounce around post-Secret Wars 2015 and like all new, all different Marvel, but it wasn't really until Spider-Man issue number 234, which was specifically a Miles Morales comic, kind of his introduction into the main Marvel universe after the events of Secret Wars 2015, that you actually saw the suit return in a meaningful way. Although it was a little bit modified. Instead of it being a gold and red suit, it had actually been adjusted by a woman named Ceres. Now, Ceres was kind of like an arms dealer and an arms designer, and so her getting the suit was just kind of restructuring the way that it looked. But functionally, it was pretty much the same thing. The suit was actually attained by Miles Morales' uncle, Aaron Davis, and then he teamed up with the villains Hobgoblin, Spot, Electro, and Sandman, and actually tried to basically steal a S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. Ultimately, it all went belly up. But between Spider-Man 234 and Miles Morales' Spider-Man Volume 1, issue number 7, that's really where the suit makes its reappearance. Now, in Spider-Man 2099, Volume 3, issue number 1, the comic that deals with Miguel O'Hara, which we'll also reference that again here in a little bit when we get to the Punisher, you actually saw Spider-Man recreate the suit. Ultimately, didn't really keep it around all too long. And then what ended up happening is in more recent years with a story called Carnage Reigns, where Carnage literally goes on a warpath and actually finds himself in a direct fight with Miles Morales, because Miles was quite literally being taken to the woodshed by Carnage. Bro, he was beating that kid within an inch of his life. Iron Man swooped in and then gave Miles Morales a kind of modified version of the Iron Spider suit. But instead of it being based on the original design, which was something that he essentially would just put on, instead, Miles was actually given nanites that entered into his bloodstream, healed him from his injuries, and then encased him the same way the old Iron Man Extremis tech did, and then gave him this new armor. Now, once everything was done, the fight was over, Iron Man took it back, so it really wasn't going to be a long-lasting suit. But that moves us into Bagman Beyond Spider-Man. Now, this is actually a throwback to an old comic, Amazing Spider-Man issue number 258, which is the first time that Spider-Man wore a bag on his head, and he was actually called Bombastic Bagman Spider-Man. But in this particular comic, this actually follows in the aftermath of Peter Parker sustaining an injury with a concern of Mary Jane Watson at the time, was that he wasn't ready to be Spider-Man again. And again, at that point in time, Ben Reilly was running around as Spider-Man. Don't worry, I'm not gonna leave you guys hanging. We're gonna explain this character here in a minute because it's really, really fascinating. But in order to kind of test whether or not he was ready to go back out and be Spider-Man, this actually saw him basically kind of going through a series of tests at the direction of Black Cat Felicia Hardy, as well as Captain America. But during this time, because Mary Jane Watson had handed the suit over to Felicia, and Felicia wouldn't give it back to Spider-Man, he had to find something else to wear. So he's literally swinging through the city with a paper bag over his head. A part of me wants to make a South Park reference, right, from Chef. It's called a paper bag. But it is kind of a cool little throwback to the old Amazing Spider-Man 258 story. But that leads us into Chasm, and specifically, it leads us into Ben Reilly, because the Chasm skin in the game is not a Peter Parker costume, that's a Ben Reilly costume. So one of the things to know in Marvel is that Peter Parker had actually been cloned twice. The first clone was Ben Reilly. Of course, he was created by Miles Warren, also known as the Jackal. The second clone was Kane. Now, Kane's kind of the more sadistic version of the three. He's pretty hyper-violent and really is more akin to the Punisher, at least in the old school version of Kane from the 1990s, than like Peter Parker or Ben Reilly, who were, for the most part, traditional superheroes. But what ended up happening is that over the years, Ben Reilly as a character has just kind of bounced around, right? At the time that he was introduced, it was just an interesting story with the original Clone Saga. In the late 1990s, Marvel tried to bring the Clone Saga back. That's when they introduced Kane. And that's the Clone Saga most of you guys hear about when you hear about how like Marvel wrote this terrible story regarding the Clone Saga and Spider-Man. The idea of Ben, though, is that over the years, he's just kind of floated around. He's had like stories where he was a Scarlet Spider, and he's been cool. He's been pretty interesting for the most part. But during this time, when he becomes Chasm, he'd actually found work with a company called the Beyond Corporation, which was a pretty nefarious organization. They kind of had their roots in the super powerful group called the Beyonders. If you don't know what that means, it's not overly important to this. The meat and potatoes of this is that at one time in Marvel Comics, Peter Parker had become a billionaire, and he owned a company called Parker Industries. Now, Parker Industries ended up going belly up. Peter just didn't want that level of responsibility. But one of the things that he had done is he had taken the kind of intellectual idea of Spider-Man, right, the concept of the hero, and had handed it over to his own company. So Parker Industries owned the rights to Spider-Man. When Parker Industries went belly up, Beyond Corporation bought it. And so Beyond Corporation owned the rights to Spider-Man. They in turn handed it over to Ben Reilly, and that's how Ben Reilly became an employee of the Beyond Corporation as Spider-Man. Now, during this time, Beyond Corporation basically screwed with his head, kind of erasing some of his memories, and that while most of his memories were basically identical to the memories of Peter Parker, now that they were gone, he didn't really know what his life was about. And so he actually found himself in a direct fight with Peter Parker because Peter wouldn't fill in the missing gaps. And so this goes directly into a story called Dark Web. No, it's not interesting. Yes, it is bad. It's a terrible story. But during this time, when Peter Parker and Ben Reilly had fought one another, Ben Reilly had been exposed to a kind of substance that had effectively driven him mad, and he adopted the identity of Chasm and changed his costume. So Ben Reilly technically becomes Chasm, kind of, in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, issue number 93, but it's not really until Dark Web issue number 1 that you see him wearing the Chasm outfit when he's kind of going on the hunt. Now, ultimately, he makes a deal with Madeline Pryor, the clone of Jean Grey, who's basically leading demons out of limbo, and they kind of ally with each other, right? Because they're both clones. They both decide they want to attack New York City in a demonic invasion, and Ben Reilly wants to destroy Spider-Man right now. The story ends the way you would expect it to end, right? Ben Reilly's defeated after a change of heart, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure that over time, Marvel Rivals is going to add even more and more skins to the list. I mean, with them costing anywhere between 10 to 26 bucks a pop, you better believe they're going to milk that for all it's worth. And so the Scarlet Spider suit by Kane is actually, and a lot of people consider it to be, the best looking Spider-Man suit in all of Marvel Comics. But one of the things that I do want to specify here is outside of the Iron Spider suit, none of these costumes really have any significant abilities unto themselves. The costumes are really more representative of the characters who are wearing them and their kind of status within Marvel Comics. So the Kane Scarlet Spider costume is a costume that is designed to look almost kind of hyper-violent, right? Extremely aggressive, because Kane, as a clone of Spider-Man, was an extremely aggressive character. But that takes us out of Spider-Man, and it takes us to Doreen Green, also known as Squirrel Girl. Now, there's not 1 ounce of lore to talk about here. I mean, I guess there is to a degree, right? Like the Urban Hunter skin is actually a modified version of a skin that was basically provided in a variant cover for US Avengers issues 1 and issue 3. It's not a one-to-one translation. And so Doreen Green as a character is basically a mutant that can communicate with squirrels, but do not let that fool you. There's 2 things to understand about Squirrel Girl. Number 1, she's defeated some of the most powerful characters in the history of Marvel Comics. It always happens off panel, but she's defeated like Thanos and guys like that. You never see it happen, right? It's just some kind of like Christmas special or something like that, where the Watcher is just like, yep, I saw it with my own 2 eyes. You defeated Thanos. It's incredible that you did it, right? She defeated Dr. Doom, and that iconic scene from Marvel, right, where he's like, confound these wretched rodents. For every one that I throw off, another one vexes me, or something to that effect. But the second thing to know about Squirrel Girl is her fan base is die hard. Son. If you don't believe me, go on Twitter and start talking trash about Squirrel Girl and watch how fast those folks jump out of cracks in the ground. They'll come from nowhere, man, and they will defend her with their dying breath, which is fair. She's pretty dope. She's a really, really fun character in Marvel, and I'm pretty sure Wolverine banged her at one point. But kind of continuing on here, the Arctic Lima skin, that's wholly new for Marvel Rivals. That doesn't really have any lore within Marvel Comics itself. Now that takes us into the Punisher, Frank Castle. Now, of course, you have the traditional Punisher skin, albeit with some modifications to kind of fit more in line with the design aesthetic for Marvel Rivals. But then you have Punisher 2099. Now, one of the things to know is that Punisher 2099 is not Frank Castle. This is actually a guy named Jacob Gallows, and his origin is covered in like the first 6 issues of the Punisher 2099 story. And it basically explained that he was like a member of the Public Eye, which was more or less a kind of secret police slash paramilitary group that controlled Nueva York in 2099, because that is the future where you get like Spider-Man 2099, right? Miguel O'Hara. Most of you guys know him from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But sticking with the Punisher, the difference between Frank Castle and Jacob, as most of you guys know, Frank Castle's family was killed in Central Park in a shootout among some rival gangs or mobsters or whatever the case happened to be. Jacob's not that way. In fact, Jacob actually chose his life with the Public Eye as well as the Church of Thor over his own family. Now, in 2099, the Church of Thor is literally a kind of religious group that believes that Thor will return one day. He'll wield his hammer and he'll basically cast off all the corrupt, CEOs and government officials and yada, 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 and all that kind of stuff. But what really separates Jacob from Frank and where Jacob became the Punisher really happened when his mother and his sister-in-law were killed at the direction of Kron Stone, who was the vice president of the massively corrupt conglomerate Alchemax. And so Jacob ended up stumbling across the war journal of the original Frank Castle, which basically detailed his war on crime and his worldview and why he did the kind of things that he did. And so Jacob decided to adopt the moniker of the Punisher and then went on a warpath. Now, after this, you go into the camo skin. Again, this is unique to Marvel Rivals, so there's no real lore behind any of this. But then you go into Thor. Right now, here's the thing. There's only one real skin here from Thor that actually has any lore behind it. And Marvel Rivals calls it the Herald of Thunder skin. Most people in Marvel refer to this version of Thor as Herald of Galactus Thor. And the reason why is because this debuted in Thor Volume 6 by Donny Cates in Volume 1, which is actually called the Devourer King. Some people also call it the Black Winter. And the idea was that Odin had basically died, and so Thor inherited the Odin Force, which some people called it the Thor Force, but then he becomes a herald of Galactus. And the reason why is because Galactus arrives on Asgard really out of desperation and seeks out the assistance of Thor in finding like 5 unique planets that have a very unique energy signature that will beef up the power of Galactus more than he's normally capable of. The reason for that is because there is a being that's traveling the multiverse, wiping out entire universes, called the Black Winter. And what Galactus needed was to amplify his power in order to destroy the Black Winter. Now, ultimately, the Black Winter is destroyed, but Thor, during this point in time, is imbued with the power cosmic by Galactus. So arguably, it's Thor at his most powerful, outside of Rune King Thor. But at this point, Thor has the Odin Force and the power cosmic. It's absolutely nuts. But again, this is the only Thor skin that has any real lore associated with it. And that takes us into Psylocke. Now, much like Thor, the traditional costume that you see with Psylocke, the one that everybody's buying so they can see her backside, that one is the only one that has any real lore associated with it. And that one debuted technically in Uncanny X-Men issue number 256, but the lore goes back about 20-something issues, technically 21, to Uncanny X-Men 225. And this was a story that was called The Fall of Mutants. One of the things that I do want to specify here, if you choose to go and read this story arc, is that it does span things like Uncanny X-Men and New Mutants and X-Factor, but each one of those comics kind of covers the Fall of Mutants in their own way, and they're all disconnected. They're sort of separate from each other. So X-Factor, for example, deals with Angel Warren Worthington becoming Archangel under the control of Apocalypse, and then, of course, facing off against X-Factor along with the other 3 Horsemen. You guys probably remember that from like X-Men the Animated Series, right? Just to kind of give you a little bit of context here. For Uncanny X-Men and the character of Psylocke, for the most part, up until this point in Marvel, she was a British woman named Betsy Braddock. What ended up happening is that there was a point when Storm and Forge ended up facing off against a being called the Adversary, who initially was just kind of his own guy, right? Just kind of a villain who was there. In more recent years, Marvel's actually revealed he's a facsimile of a character called the Shadow King, who's just this kind of multiversal force of evil, essentially, right? Like nightmares manifested, right? If we really want to look at it from that perspective. But what ended up happening here is that during the Uncanny X-Men tie-in to Fall of Mutants, the Uncanny X-Men joined Storm and Forge in their fight against the Adversary. And in order to win this fight, the X-Men essentially had to sacrifice their lives. This is when a character named Roma appeared. And we don't have to go into her whole lore, but all Roma did is she presented the X-Men with something called the Siege Perilous, that if they chose to pass through it, they could essentially restart their lives. Betsy Braddock did exactly that. When that happened, she washed up on the shores of the South China Sea, and she was met by the leader of the mystical ninja organization called the Hand. Now, this guy had his own girl named Quanon, and what ended up happening is that he kind of enlisted the aid of basically this kind of crazy woman who worked for a guy named Mojo. But the long and short of it is that she was good with sorcery. And so what this woman did is she took the mind of Betsy Braddock and then put it in the body of Quanon. Then she took the mind of Quanon, because Quanon was comatose, and put it in the body of Betsy Braddock, effectively swapping their minds. So when Betsy Braddock woke up, she woke up in the body of a woman from Southeast Asia. And so what ended up happening following that is she kind of worked for the Hand for a little while, albeit being brainwashed, and then she was sent on a mission to face off against Wolverine. Wolverine woke her up to who she actually was, undid her brainwashing, and following that, basically Psylocke went forward as a woman from Southeast Asia. Eventually Marvel undid it all, right? And they just kind of set her back to her normal British self. But that's why Psylocke, if you look at her now, is a woman who's British. Whereas in this version, it looks like she's a person from Southeast Asia, because this was a time when Marvel had them swap bodies. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. I know there's a lot of characters we didn't cover, so here's what I want. Let me know if you guys enjoy this kind of thing. Let me know if you find it to be interesting. And yeah, if you do, we'll do some more. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.